Hey everyone, thanks for your time. In this first video of a series, I'll start previewing the work that NASA's Exploration Ground Systems program will be doing with the Artemis II Orion spacecraft when they receive it in a couple of months. Orion prime contractor Lockheed Martin is finishing up assembly and test of the spacecraft at the Kennedy Space Center, and when they are done, they will officially hand it over to Exploration Ground Systems for launch processing. I interviewed the head of the EGS team that will get the spacecraft ready for stacking. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Loading storable propellants and other commodities on board, stacking the Launch Abort System, and encapsulation. Then Orion will go to the vehicle assembly building to stack on top of SLS for this crewed circumlunar mission. It's the end of February 2025, so there's the caveat about possible disruptions from those in power. For the purposes of this podcast, I'll set aside those big concerns and report on them in other regular podcasts. For now, let's listen to the interview with a bunch of visual aids to provide context and perspective. Late last week, I interviewed Marcos Pena, who is NASA Operations Manager for Exploration Ground Systems Spacecraft Offline Operations. As the name implies, EGS Spacecraft Offline Operations processes elements of Orion and SLS in locations away from Launch Complex 39 and the Vehicle Assembly Building, where EGS Integrated Operations puts together the whole vehicle on the mobile launcher. As we saw in the second half of 2023 and the second half of last year, 2024, much of the larger hardware for SLS, the boosters, core stage, and launch vehicle stage adapter were transported directly to the LC-39 area. The boosters were brought in on rail cars to the Rotation Processing and Surge facility, and the core stage and LVSA came in on the agency's Pegasus barge to the turn basin. Those elements were then towed into the VAB for storage until stacking. For Artemis I, II, and III, spacecraft offline operations will receive Orion, the SLS second stage called the Interim Cryogenic Propulsion Stage or ICPS, and the Orion stage adapter at KSC from prime contractors and other NASA programs. For Artemis II, Lockheed Martin is finishing Orion assembly, the ICPS is being stored by prime contractor United Launch Alliance, and the OSA is similarly stored at Marshall Space Flight Center. EGS is preparing to receive those elements in the next couple of months for final launch preparations. Once those are handed over to spacecraft offline operations, they will make final preparations for those pieces to be stacked in the VAB. The first place that Orion and ICPS will go for EGS launch processing is the MPPF, the Multi-Payload Processing Facility. The MPPF is used by NASA Kennedy Space Center for hazardous operations like toxic chemical handling, such as the storable bipropellants that Orion uses and the hydrazine monopropellant that both Orion and ICPS use. I started by asking about some Orion hardware that is already in the MPPF, the ETA or Environmental Test Article. That's primarily the Artemis I Orion crew module, minus some hardware like its heat shield, which was replaced by a representative structure. The Orion ETA is still in the MPPF, but I guess just a sense of you guys getting ready for, you've got the Orion and the ICPS for Artemis II coming into the MPPF and getting those turned over to you and where things stand with all of that.
Sure, yeah, I can go over that. So, glad you asked about ETA. The ETA, aka Environmental Test Article, basically the Artemis I capsule, is currently in the MPPF in our deservicing bay. And we're currently wrapping up some functional tests of the propulsion system. So the ETA came back December of this year from Armstrong Test Facility, formerly Plumbrook. They subjected it to several environments, and now the capsule is back to KSC, where we are doing some functional tests on the prop system. That is all occurring in the deservicing bay, and it's actually out of the way of any of our Artemis II processing. So that deservicing bay, we wouldn't use it again until Artemis II launches, splashes down, and comes back to KSC. So right now it's kind of in there, tucked away on the northwest corner, actually actually southeast corner, I'm flipped, of the MPPF, and we are wrapping up that testing over the next week or so.
Let's go off on a tangent about the layout of the MPPF high bay, because that is where ICPS and Orion are headed. As Mr. Pena noted, the Orion ETA is in the deservicing bay. If we look at a couple of old posters from a decade ago when EGS was still known as Ground Systems Development and Operations, or GSDO, we see in the one on the left, the deservicing bay is on the left, the servicing platforms on the right, and servicing-deservicing equipment in between them. From this vantage point, looking roughly north to south, the transfer aisle is in the foreground. If we take a quick look at time-lapse video when the Orion ETA returned to the MPPF before Christmas, this is shot looking down the transfer aisle from west to east and could be taken from the servicing platform. At the end of the video, we see the ETA lifted out of the transportation carrier and into the deservicing bay stand. It appears that in shots taken a month ago in mid-January, when most of the Artemis II prime and backup flight crew members visited, that the ETA had been moved out partially into the transfer aisle. But that will be needed when ICPS arrives. That is the next Artemis II hardware planned to visit the MPPF, and I asked about that schedule next.
This is just the question then, because we were wondering when the ICPS was going to move over from the dock. I don't know if that's the last schedule we heard was around this time, mid-February. Has that been adjusted? When is it expected in there now?
Yeah, we did adjust it a little bit. It's currently planning to be delivered to the MPPF in about 3 weeks. I think are currently tracking to March 4. But that could fluctuate a little bit. But yeah, we're expecting in about 3 weeks, at which point we are going to do some hydrazine loading onto the reaction control system tanks. So, the ICPS is a cryogenic stage, so the actual fueling of the stage happens through the ML when you're out at the pad, just like the core stage. However, it does have a RCS system for steering in space, and that uses storable propellants, hydrazine. So we are going to be loading hydrazine at the MPPF, which is where we do hazardous processing. And that work is going to occur in early March. And then ICPS will be there probably a few weeks more until we send it out to the VAB for stacking around the April timeframe.
Actually, both the ICPS Attitude Control System and the Orion Crew Module Reaction Control System use monopropellant hydrazine for their thrusters. It's the service module, and specifically the European service module part of the service module, that uses monomethyl hydrazine as one of the hypergolic bipropellants. So this time, ICPS for Artemis II would arrive in the MPPF first, before Orion. For Artemis I, Orion was already set up in the servicing stand when ICPS arrived. In this shot from February 2021, you can see what Mr. Pena talks about next in terms of blocking traffic, and why the plan is to finish with loading the Artemis II ICPS ACS tanks before this Orion shows up at the MPPF door.
Our goal is to, get the ICPS serviced in March, like I mentioned, and then the ICPS does block the transfer aisle of the MPPF where Orion will come in through. So we do plan on finishing up ICPS, sending it over to the VAB once it's ready for stacking around April, and at which point we are ready to receive Orion because we've cleared the space that's needed to get Orion into the servicing stand.
So the plan is for ICPS to be in the VAB before Orion arrives in the MPPF. If the mid-April forecast we heard back before Christmas were to hold, then ICPS might be stacked on top of the rest of SLS by the time that Orion reaches the MPPF, as Mr. Pena notes.
As you know, Orion Artemis II operations is still in the ATLO phase. So Lockheed, they are the ones who are. We don't follow that schedule as close within EGS, but we do communicate, and our delivery date that we're currently tracking to is end of April, which lines up with our need dates. I'm sure there's probably some fluctuations there in days, but right now, end of April is when we are working to as far as getting all our paper, our procedures, all of our GSC, all of our parts, and our trained personnel. End of April is what we're working to.
I'll come back to all the work that is planned in the MPPF and then later in the LASIF, but there's a lot of interest in when Artemis II could be ready to launch, so let's skip ahead to later in the interview. I asked Mr. Pena how long they are planning for the work in the MPPF to take, and he went through the timeline for both the MPPF and the LASIF.
So the sort of the $64,000 question is, how much time is allotted for to do all of this work in the MPPF, and is there any sense of how much contingency time or margin that's in the schedule for all of the operations there?
Copy. Yeah, I can answer that. So we have about 3 months of operations in the MPPF. About 2.5 months of that is the commodity loading, and then on the third month we're doing the internal crew work that I just mentioned. So it's about 3 months of work. Then in the LASIF we have close to 2 months. So in total you're looking at like 5 months. This is all occurring in parallel to the operations in the VAB. We are mating the core stage here and in a couple weeks. Then we have to, do several testing with the core stage. We got to do stack the LVSAs, stack the ICPS, hook up umbilicals, do pirate testing. So all that's going to be occurring in parallel to the MPPF and LASIF processing. It's hard to say how much margin we have between the offline flow and how that work lays out in comparison to the VAB operations. I would say that our plan is to process Orion, do offline operations per our current schedule as quickly as we can, and stack Orion. Now, if the schedule that I just mentioned grew some, it does not translate directly to a schedule slip of the launch.
Right. Okay.
We have some play there, some margin.
5 months from late April would essentially be late September or early October, and that represents a best-case scenario. There is the caveat that Mr. Pena noted, which is that there is overall margin in the schedule to the official target of no later than April 2026. He also noted that Orion and SLS launch preps will be performed in parallel in the spring and summer, and what this likely means is that we'll be following the progress of that work in the VAB, the MPPF, and the LASIF likely through the summertime to see where they are. In theory, if SLS were ready for a tanking test at the beginning of the fall and Orion were ready to stack at the same time, or thereabouts, NASA could choose to go ahead and stack Orion first and do a tanking test with the full stack. If SLS were to be ready for a tanking test significantly earlier than Orion, then maybe NASA would opt to go ahead and do the tanking test without Orion, then roll back to the VAB to complete stacking. If it's the other way around, and Orion is ahead of SLS for some reason, that means something has changed and Orion would no longer be the critical path. We'd probably see that well ahead of time, though. If EGS can finish the commodity loading in the MPPF in 3 months, then we'd see Orion move to the LASIF in the late July-August timeframe, and that would be one of the obvious milestones for spacecraft offline processing. I asked Mr. Pena about spacecraft offline ops readiness for Orion when they take custody of it from Lockheed Martin and it moves into the MPPF.
Generally speaking, your team is ready to go, ready to roll with Orion when it moves into the MPPF, and because I know that this is at least my understanding, and that would be the next question. But you guys are ready when Orion arrives in the MPPF to get going? I know that's going to probably be one of the pinch points.
Yep, absolutely. There's, of course, work that's still going on in parallel. We're updating the procedures between Artemis 1 and 2. There's some lessons learned during the first flow of Artemis 1. We had some challenges with sampling and some of the GSC that hooks up to Orion to help the commodity loading. So all the GSC development, all that work's wrapped up, but we're still getting all our procedures ready. However, everything is on track to support the need dates and at the end of April.
Okay. Then
so there's still procedure updates that are occurring.
Okay.
Yeah.
The work in the MPPF is the longer, more complicated sequence, and next I asked about that.
The expected sequence of commodity loading and work in the MPPF, and so now we have the service module has a full complement of consumable tanks and it's fully crew rated. Can you talk about the planned sequence of commodity loading and how what additional things you have to load on the spacecraft because it's now fully crewed?
Copy that. Yeah, so I tell you, I don't have the actual full schedule in front of me right now. Otherwise, I would have cheated and gone and looked directly at it. But I could give you just a general sense. So for the servicing between Artemis 1 and Artemis 2 is largely the same. We used a Multi-Payload Processing Facility to do hazardous processing. So this is where we're going to load all the hypergalls. We are currently, I believe, we're planning to do the SM hypers first. SM, as you may be aware, is a biprop system. So we have to do the nitrogen tetroxide and the MMH, monomethylhydrazine, on the SM. We do the SM up front because we have a requirement to monitor it for 25 to 30 days to ensure that the vehicle's plumbing is tight. So that's the way that we optimize the flow. We do SM, MMH, and nitrogen tetroxide. I'm not sure exactly which one's first, but those are back to back. Then we have to do CM. The CM has a monoprop system which uses hydrazine, so we do that as well. And then you get into your non-hazardous, non-hypergolic commodities. So in the MPPF, we'll also be loading GN2 on the service module, which is needed for the mission. And everything that I said so far is common with Artemis 1. We'll also be loading ammonia into the vehicle. So ammonia, hypergalls, GN2, those are all things that we serviced during Artemis 1, and we'll essentially be doing those procedures the same way as Artemis 1, with some enhancements that we're capturing in the procedures and to some of our ground support equipment. Where we get into new work for this crew-rated vehicle, we're looking at adding oxygen. We will be performing O2 servicing on the SM and on the CM at the MPPF. That's the main new commodity that we're adding at the MPPF. However, we will also be loading liquid cooling garment fluid. It's used the short-term LCG. We'll be loading that fluid in the MPPF as well. After we've loaded all the other commodities, we'll load the LCG fluid, and that is to support crew testing that we're going to do in the MPPF, which I'm sure you'll want to talk about. But yeah, so after all the commodities are loaded, we'll do LCG loading, and then we'll be ready to perform some testing with our Artemis II crew.
So here's a list of those commodities provided via a follow-up with NASA Kennedy Space Center Public Affairs. As was noted with the provided list, this is not a strict order. It may be changed to optimize the workflow. And there's the note from Mr. Pena in the interview that the ESM bipropellants would be loaded first due to that multi-week monitoring requirement. All the engines on the ESM use the storable hypergolic propellants, the main shuttle-proven orbital maneuvering system engine, the aux engines, and the reaction control system thrusters. The ammonia system will be serviced. Orion has nitrogen tanks and also helium tanks for pressurizing the prop system in both the crew and service modules. In some cases, such as the service module helium, that might already have been serviced in the O&C building prior to the official handover from Lockheed to EGS. And in addition to that, there are the commodities for the flight crew, oxygen being the big one that is loaded in the MPPF, but also, as Mr. Pena noted, the liquid cooling garment fluid loop will also be serviced in the MPPF. One of the crew consumable commodities that wasn't mentioned was water, so I followed up about that.
I'd mentioned the oxygen in the water, and I if I recall correctly, there was you did load some, maybe one water tank, or I can't remember if the ESM was fully outfitted since it wasn't uncrewed. But I mean, are you load? This is obviously a full load of water that would just be somewhere in the sequence in the MPPF, or would the water be loaded somewhere else?
So yeah, good question. I did not address that for the MPPF, and it's because we don't service in the MPPF. We service it in the VAB. That's one of those commodities that we want to load closer to launch, and the reason being is because if you load it too long, you load it too early, and the fluid sits in there. It's mainly DI water with a compound called silver biocide, and if it sits in the vehicle for too long, testing has shown that it leads to some plating issues with tanks. So, given that the Orion and ESA team have determined that you don't want to service the water with silver biocide mixture too soon, we've opted to do that closer to launch, probably like a month or two before we roll out to the pad for a launch attempt. So potable water, it's what we call the system. That servicing occurs in the VAB after Orion is stacked. During Artemis I, there was one tank, as you noted, that was filled, and that was actually filled in the O&C. I don't recall the rationale for the one tank, but it was done in O&C, and it didn't have all these similar plating concerns because, of course, that water was not going to be used for crew.
Next, I asked about what critical path there is for MPPF servicing.
Is there, in the sequence of the hazardous and non-hazardous commodity loading, is there sort of a critical path through there, or one of the commodities that's sort of the long pole in that?
Yeah, I did cover that. That would be the two commodities, the hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide that we load at first. That has that monitoring period. Okay. One was 25, the other is 30 days. So that we won't roll out of the MPPF until we've satisfied that monitoring requirement. So that is, in essence, in the critical path. However, that clock, say that 30-day clock, will expire while we're still doing other servicing operations. So in essence, the entire sequence of work in the MPPF is critical path. It's all serial. We're not going to be loading multiple commodities at a time. You can't do a lot of these work in parallel because they're hazardous. You can't do an oxidizer and a fuel at the same time, for example. That would be a bad day. And you can't do, for example, a GN2 loading while you're doing hypergauze loading because hypergauze loading requires clears. So the commodity loading, in essence, is all serial. And then at the end, we do the crew-related activities that we're going to talk about shortly. And those operations cannot occur when you're adding commodities to the vehicle. So in essence, it's all serial.
As Mr. Pena noted, from a safety standpoint, the hypergolic oxidizer, nitrogen tetroxide, and the two types of hydrazine are highly toxic, so the MPPF will be cleared of pretty much everyone except the personnel who need to have hands on the loading equipment, and those people will be in self-contained suits for protection. Hypergolics ignite on contact, so as he mentioned, you don't load those in parallel because a spill or leak could lead to an explosion. Thanks for watching. Click on the like button if you found this video informative. There's more to cover in the interview, including plans for testing in the MPPF with the Artemis II flight crew and the work in the Launch Abort System facility. I'll go through those details in a second upcoming video, and we'll be following along as much as possible when the work actually occurs.